All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So, this week I'm going to talk to you guys about what the nation looked like right after the Constitution was established and kind of the first few years of our country's founding. So, we're going to talk mainly about the politics and the political fights that happened during this period. This era, in the first years of the new republic, the United States was dealing with a lot of threats. These threats were both internal but also external. One of the internal threats that was already emerging was political in nature, and that was the rise of political parties. In the debates over the Constitution, we've already seen there were two factions emerging. We talked this week about the Federalists and the Anti Federalists. Even though the Constitution had basically enshrined the Federalist perspective, the ideas of the Anti Federalists did not go away, even though their movement faded away. The belief in a powerful central government being a threat to liberty continued, and it very much continues to influence American political culture to this day. It was widely believed among the founding fathers that maintaining political harmony was crucial to the success of the American experiment. The founding fathers were very anxious to avoid the emergence of political parties, which had already begun to crop up in several states. Parties were considered divisive and disloyal. Madison had talked about them in one of the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10. He talked about what he called factions. And he said, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Remember that the founding fathers very much believed in this idea of republicanism, the idea that in a republic, citizens had to have what they called civic virtue. And part of that meant they had to set aside their own personal self interest and work for the common good. So Madison said factions are antithetical to that idea of republicanism because here's a group of citizens who have some common interest that is adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And they're going to work for their own interest and not work for the interests of the common good or for, they're going to work actively against the rights of other citizens. Now, Madison did not believe that factions could be eliminated because he knew it was part of human nature to have opinions about things and to group together with other like minded individuals against those who held the opposing opinion. But he argued that the effects of factions, the negative effects of factions, could be controlled if the Republic was organized very well. Now, the Constitution made no mention of political parties. And the original method of electing the president assumed that candidates would run as individuals, not on a party ticket. But despite the opposition of the founding fathers and the provisions of the Constitution, political parties soon emerged, and this era of the early republic became a period of intense political rhetoric and very passionate debate about the future of the United States. Washington was almost inevitably and unanimously elected as the first president, mostly because he was such a universally beloved and well-regarded figure. There was really no one else who commanded the kind of respect and regard throughout the nation that Washington did. Washington quickly sets out filling positions in his administration, and he brings on board some of the nation's most prominent political leaders, including Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton to lead the Treasury Department. And it was really a division between these two men and the interests and the ideas that they represented that sets the stage for the emergence of the first political parties in the United States. Now, today, it's usually the Secretary of State who is the most influential and important member of the president's cabinet. But initially, the main influence and power was held by the Secretary of the Treasury. Alexander Hamilton was just 34 years old when he became Secretary of the Treasury, and he was enormously ambitious, both for himself, but more importantly, for his new country. Hamilton envisioned the United States becoming a great and powerful nation to rival Great Britain and the other states of modern Europe. He believed the United States should be led by an active, energetic, strong central government, and he believed it was destined for the accomplishment of great purposes, as he put it. During 1790 and 1791, Hamilton, being directed by Congress to do so, developed a financial plan for the new nation that was designed to establish America's financial stability and encourage the United States' economic development. In the long term, his goal was to make the U.S. a major commercial and military power. So his program had 5 parts. The first part was to establish a line of credit, to create conditions under which people would loan money to the government by purchasing its bonds, because they were confident that those loans would be repaid. In order to do this, Hamilton argued that the federal government should assume responsibility for paying off all of the considerable debt that had been inherited from the American Revolution by the states, as well as the outstanding debts of the national government. This amounted to about $79 million in total. To do this, he would create a new national debt. Those old debts would be replaced by new interest-bearing bonds issued to the government's creditors. This, he argued, would give wealthy individuals a stake in promoting the stability of the United States. The stronger and more economically secure the federal government was, the more likely it would be able to pay its debts. So in this case, Hamilton is saying having a national debt is actually a good thing, because that means we can establish a national line of credit. To manage all of this, he said, we need a Bank of the United States. We need a main financial agent for the nation. This would be, under Hamilton's plan, a private corporation that would hold the government's money, hold the public funds, that would issue banknotes that could serve as currency, and that would make loans to the federal government. He also argued that there should be a tax on whiskey producers to raise revenue for the government, and he wrote what he called a report on manufacturers that called for a tariff, a tax on foreign imported goods to stimulate and promote domestic manufacturing, and government subsidies to encourage domestic manufacturing. So remember, Hamilton wants the U.S. to be a major economic power, and he believes that the way to do that is to promote industry, to promote the U.S. as a manufacturing center. Hamilton's plan got a lot of support from American financial interests, from manufacturers, from merchants, but others were not so keen on his vision, because his plan really hinges on keeping close ties with England, which is still America's main trading partner at this point. And because his plan because others had a very different vision for what they wanted the country to be. Specifically, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, they also have a vision for America, and it's very different. They believe that the future of the United States lay in westward expansion, in land, and their goal was a largely agrarian republic of independent farmers. So they are not keen on establishing America as a business and manufacturing center. They think America's power lies in its land and lies in being a nation of farmers. They see Hamilton's plan as a threat because it forges an alliance with a very powerful central government and an emerging class of business owners, commercial capitalists. They were worried he was taking them back down the same road that they had veered away from by seeking independence from England. Hamilton wanted to maintain a standing army as well, and that seemed like a big threat to American freedom. They didn't like his idea of a national bank. They didn't like the idea that the federal government would assume the state's debts because they were afraid this would introduce corruption. Opposition to Hamilton's plan comes almost entirely from the South. And of course, it's the South that is the most agrarian region of the country. It's the South that has the least interest in manufacturing and has the most agrarian economy. And it's also the South that doesn't have a lot of revolutionary debt because they don't have to pay for their own labor. The South uses enslaved labor, and so they don't, have the same amount of Revolutionary War debt that the northern states do. Famously, Jefferson and Madison sit down for a dinner with Hamilton, and they strike a deal. They work out a backroom deal. The Southerners said, okay, we'll accept your financial program, minus the subsidies to manufacturers, because we think that's just too much money, and we don't think that the government should be doing that. In exchange for the establishment of the nation's capital, a permanent national capital, on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. So they want the nation's capital to be located closer to the southern states. Right now, it's either in Philadelphia or New York. It's been sort of bouncing back and forth between those two cities. So this initial controversy over how the nation's finances would be handled was settled, but out of this debate emerges the first two-party system in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, there are lots of threats that the nation is facing, and there are also foreign threats that are impinging on the United States and threatening to divide the country politically. Americans are watching what's been going on back in Europe with their former ally, the French, and they are becoming deeply divided over the events of the French Revolution. When the French Revolution began in 1789, most Americans were very happy about it. They were very happy to hear the news that the French have now been inspired by the American Revolution, and they've taken matters into their own hands to change their system of government. As the French Revolution becomes more and more radical by the early 1790s, especially after the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, many people are starting to become more and more concerned about what was going on and the implications of what's happening in France with the revolution. Jefferson and his followers believed that the new French Republic should be defended, and that this is a historic victory for the idea of popular self-government. To Washington and Hamilton, however, what's happening in France is nothing short of very alarming anarchy. The big question was whether the U.S. is going to take sides in the ongoing conflict and rivalry between Britain and France. The French, of course, had helped us to win the War of Independence, and we had declared a permanent alliance with them back in 1778. But the U.S. is in no position right now to come to France's aid. And so in April of 1793, Washington issues a proclamation of American neutrality. But it was really hard to stay neutral with this war going on when American ships are trying to cross the Atlantic and continue to trade with Britain and France, and the British are seizing American ships trading with the French and continuing this practice of impressment, basically kidnapping American citizens on these ships to serve in the British Navy. Washington sends his Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to London to present Americans' objections to these practices. Jay comes back with a treaty in 1794 that doesn't make a lot of Washington's critics very happy. He is not able to get the British to concede to stop impressing American sailors or to stop seizing American ships. All that the British agreed to in this treaty was to abandon their outposts on the western frontier, which they were already supposed to have done back in 1783. In return, the U.S. guaranteed favorable treatment to British imported goods. People opposed to this agreement argued that this meant the U.S. is basically effectively taking the side of the British in their war against France. So Jefferson and his supporters, who are supporters of the French, are very unhappy about this. So by the mid-1790s, then, we have two coherent parties emerging in Congress, calling themselves Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. The Jeffersonian Republicans, by the way, have no connection to the current Republican Party. That doesn't get founded until the 1850s. Both the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans believed they were the guardians of liberty and the ideals of the Revolution, and each side accused its opponent of engaging in a conspiracy to destroy those ideals. The Federalists were supporters of the Washington administration. They tended to, like Hamilton's economic program, they favored maintaining very close ties with the British. They liked having a strong central government. They wanted the economy to be very robust and diverse. And they were mainly prosperous merchants, farmers, lawyers, established political leaders, especially those outside the South, and their outlook was somewhat elitist. They had a more traditional 18th century view of society as a fixed hierarchy, and they believed that public office should be reserved for the rich, the able, and the well-born. Freedom for the Federalists did not mean the right to stand up in opposition to the government. They were afraid that the spirit of liberty that had been unleashed by the American Revolution was close to degenerating into anarchy. The Federalist fears seem to be borne out here by a serious domestic crisis that erupts in 1794. Remember that Part 4 of Hamilton's financial plan had called for the government to raise revenue by placing a tax on whiskey producers. The Constitution granted the federal government the authority to levy taxes, but a lot of Americans living on the frontier did not like this whiskey tax at all, especially since these taxes are being levied by a very far away central government in Washington, D.C. Frontier settlers, especially settlers in kind of western Pennsylvania, western New York, out in kind of the Ohio River Valley, they feel like the Eastern officials don't really care about protecting them from Native Americans or helping them sell their crops. And since Western farmers had a lot of difficulty getting their perishable grain to market because the roads in the new nation were so terrible, they commonly resorted to distilling that grain into alcohol, which was less perishable and more portable. So they did not like now that the federal government was trying to tax this alcohol that they're producing. Some prevented enforcement of the tax by tarring and feathering the tax collectors. Others began meeting together to protest the taxes. Violence and protests spread throughout the frontier areas, and the Federalists see this as a genuine threat to order and to the integrity of the new United States. So in February 1794, Washington issues a proclamation saying that the government is now determined to enforce this law in the West. This leads to more violence, and 6,000 men are gathering in western Pennsylvania. They are invoking the example of revolutionary France. They are hoisting up their own flag. They are setting up mock guillotines. They are starting their own extra-legal courts. And they are actually threatening to march on the federal garrison in Pittsburgh to seize the weapons there. Some people were actually worried that they would march on Philadelphia, which was still the nation's capital at this point. In response to this, Washington calls up 15,000 militia troops from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. This is an army larger than the one he had commanded during the American Revolution. In the face of this overwhelming show of force, all of the resistance in the West just collapses. So this is really seen as kind of a test of the strength of the federal government. On the other side, the Jeffersonian Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, they are much more sympathetic toward France than the Federalists are, and they have a lot more faith in democratic self-government. They get a lot of support from wealthy Southern planters and just ordinary farmers throughout the country. Urban artisans who are also enthusiastic supporters of the French Revolution, they also sort of align themselves with the Jeffersonian Republicans. They are a lot more critical of social and economic equality or inequality, and they're more accepting of democratic participation. The political rhetoric and the infighting was incredibly heated. It's bad today. It was equally as bad or even worse in the 1790s and the early 1800s. Federalists denounced the Republicans as being traitors and anarchists. Republicans are calling the Federalists monarchists and corrupt and agents of Britain. Each side is charging the other with having betrayed the principles of the Revolution, so it's this really intense period of partisan warfare. In 1796, George Washington decides he is going to step down after having served, sort of 2 terms in office. He decides he's going to step down in 1796. And this unleashes a fierce competition over who is going to succeed him. This is the first contested presidential election, and we see 2 tickets emerging. John Adams runs as a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson runs as a Republican. The election was very close in the Electoral College. Adams got 71 Electoral College votes. Jefferson won 68. Jefferson came in second, so he becomes vice president. The voting fell entirely along sectional lines. Adams wins New England, New York, and New Jersey. Jefferson sweeps the South and Pennsylvania. So John Adams wins the presidency in 1796, but his administration ends up being beset by a series of scandals. He does not have a particularly easy time as president. In terms of his foreign policy, the U.S. is still trying to remain neutral in the war between France and Britain and continue to trade with both countries. But this is becoming increasingly difficult because both the French and the British are now seizing American ships left and right. In 1797, Adams sends a group of diplomats to Paris to negotiate a treaty to replace that old alliance that we had made with the French back in 1778. The French demanded that the Americans pay a bribe before negotiations could proceed. When all of this becomes public, the French officials are designated as Mr. X, Y, and Z in the dispatches that are being sent back to Washington from the American diplomats. So the scandal becomes known as the XYZ affair. So the fact that the French had demanded this bribe is, totally scandalous from these, sort of for the American public. It turns the American public against France. And by 1798, the U.S. is engaged in an unofficial naval war with France. By 1800, though, Adams was able to negotiate a peace with France, so things sort of quieted down on that front after a while. Domestically, things weren't much better. Faced with this very fierce mounting opposition, the Federalists attempted to pass legislation to silence their critics. That becomes known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act allowed the government to deport any person that they deemed to be, quote unquote, dangerous. The Sedition Act allowed the prosecution of virtually any public assembly or publication critical of the government. The main target here was Republican newspapers, Republican newspapers throughout the country are printing all sorts of terrible stuff about Adams and the Federalists. But this is definitely, of course, the Sedition Act is definitely in violation of the First Amendment. It's definitely a violation of the freedom of the press here. 18 individuals were charged under the Sedition Act. 10 of them were convicted of spreading, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious information about the government. Jefferson called these acts a reign of witches. So he's very much opposed to what the Federalists in Congress are doing and what the Adams administration is trying to do here. Jefferson and Madison mobilized opposition to these acts at the state level, and they drafted a couple of resolutions that get adopted by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions attacked the Sedition Act as an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment. Jefferson's draft, here we go, Jefferson, sort of including some interesting things in a draft again. Jefferson's draft of the Kentucky Resolution actually went as far as to say that states could declare acts of the federal government void and of no force within the state's jurisdiction. Now, the Kentucky legislature wisely decided, we don't think this is necessarily kosher according to the Constitution, so we're going to just take this out of the final version. But the idea is out there. No other state endorsed these resolutions, and many were horrified at the idea that states might decide that they could take action against the federal government. Most people at this point were arguing, well, it's the courts, it's not the states who are empowered to determine the constitutionality of acts of Congress. Adams himself was not really kind of the right guy for the time. He was kind of temperamentally unsuited to being president. He starts spending more and more of his time at his home in Quincy. He was very intelligent, of course, and very passionate about America's founding ideals, but he is not a politician. He doesn't really have the political acumen to deal with the divisions within his own party and the opposition from the Republicans. The Federalists, by this point, have become divided between moderates, who are led by Adams, and what were called ultras, or, very conservative Federalists, led by Hamilton, who by this time is out of public office, but he's still playing a strong role in Federalist Party politics. Adams, who is very frustrated with Hamilton's attempts to try to control his presidency, he starts insulting Hamilton. He calls him a man devoid of every moral principle. He says he's a bastard and declares him the source of all the Federalist problems and said that Jefferson was infinitely better and wiser. When Hamilton hears about this, he blows up his own party by sending a letter that was supposed to only go to prominent Federalists, just raking Adams over the coals. He says Adams has eccentric tendencies, he's jealous, he's extremely egotistical, he has this ungovernable temper, he has vanity without bounds. He says Adams has just ruined everything that Washington has established in his presidency, and he's going to bring the government to ruin. This letter gets leaked to the Republicans, and they leak it to the press, and Hamilton is horrified, and he decides, I just better release the whole thing. And this is a total disaster for him because it makes Federalists very angry at him, and it strengthens the opposition party, the Republicans. So by 1800, Federalists are a divided party, nominally led by John Adams, who is so deeply unpopular at this point with everyone, including most of his own party, that he really doesn't stand a chance of being reelected. This election was in many ways the first modern election campaign as we know it. It had deep partisan divisions, it had outright campaigning for votes, and it had a lot of negativity. The Republicans had begun to develop modern techniques for mobilizing voters, printing pamphlets, handbills, newspapers, holding mass meetings to promote their cause. The Federalists, on their part, they saw politics as an activity for a small group of elite men, and they can't really match the Republicans' mobilization. Federalists believed in the idea of popular sovereignty, that, sort of everybody should have the right to vote, and they believed in having a Republican, small r, Republican government. But they don't really see ordinary people as having much of a role to play in governing society. They are kind of increasingly out of touch with what was happening in American political life. People are getting interested in politics. People who had never before been able to vote are now suddenly able to vote because the franchise is starting to expand. And the Republicans are able to capitalize on this. The election of 1800 was the birth of negative campaigning in the United States, and things got really ugly. Jefferson's campaign accused President Adams of having a hideous, hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. In return, Adams' men called Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw sired by a Virginia mulatto father. So there's racial slurs going on. There's sort of questioning of masculinity. There's all kinds of, sort of insults being traded back and forth. It gets really ugly. Adams is labeled a fool, a hypocrite, a criminal, a tyrant. Jefferson is branded as a weakling, an atheist, a libertine, a coward. Even Martha Washington succumbed to the propaganda. She reportedly told a clergyman that Jefferson was one of the most detestable of mankind. Now, back then, most presidential candidates didn't actively campaign. So it's not Adams and Jefferson who are trading these insults back and forth against each other. They are spending most of their time at their houses in Virginia and Massachusetts, and they left the campaigning to hired surrogates or supporters in their party. However, there was one candidate, the Republican vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, whom you can see here, who does decide to personally campaign. He was one of the leaders of the Republican Party by this point, and he had developed some of these modern techniques for mobilizing voters and organizing the party that Republicans were using to great effect during the campaign. In a lot of ways, Burr was a very modern candidate. He was handsome, he was charming, he was well educated, he was from a prominent family, he had served with distinction in the Revolutionary War. He was also the very opposite of an ideologue. He never talked about his own personal beliefs. He doesn't seem to be particularly invested in the ideals of the revolution. His main characteristic seemed to be his ability to say and do whatever it took to gain a personal or political advantage. He doesn't seem to care a lot about government policy, the Constitution, or public service for its own sake. He's just really kind of looking to advance his own career. So in the end, Jefferson wins 73 Electoral College votes to Adams' 65. However, the election provokes a constitutional crisis. Because the original Constitution does not say that the electors have to distinguish between their votes for president and those for vice president, both Jefferson and the Republican vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, get the same number of Electoral College votes. It's a tie. Because of this tie, the election, according to the Constitution, goes to the House of Representatives, where each state's congressional delegation will have a single vote. The newly elected Republican-dominated Congress was not going to be sworn into office until December of 1801. So now it's suddenly possible that the lame duck Federalists in Congress will be able to engineer the election of Aaron Burr as president. A lot of Federalists wanted to do that, but others, including Alexander Hamilton, really do not like Burr. They felt like he was too much of a modern style politician, that he's willing to say and do anything to get elected. He doesn't really have any political ideals or an ideology. Hamilton, in particular, thinks Burr is a really dangerous political figure, and he writes letter after letter urging his fellow Federalists to vote against Burr and to vote for Jefferson, even though he had clashed repeatedly with Jefferson over and over. Hamilton and Burr had always been friendly with each other, but Hamilton believed that despite their friendship, Burr was really just not the right person to be president. This is, of course, one of the many reasons that Burr and Hamilton will fight a duel 4 years later, in which Hamilton gets shot and killed by Burr. Now, things get really tenuous for a while. The House of Representatives cannot come to a majority vote. Republican newspapers are talking about getting the military involved. The governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania begin preparing their state militias for action. Mobs are gathering in Washington, D.C., and they are threatening to prevent any president from being appointed by statute. Republicans are threatening to call for a new constitutional convention. Finally, after one Federalist gets word from a Republican that Jefferson is going to agree to keep the Federalist financial program and refrain from dismissing any Federalist office holders without good cause, the Federalists believe that they have a deal with Jefferson. And on the 36th ballot, they finally declare that Jefferson has won and he is now the president. To avoid repeating this kind of debacle in the future, the country adopts the 12th Amendment, which allows the electors to vote separately for president and vice president. The election of 1800 was one of the first popular elections in modern history that resulted in the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. Jefferson, in his inaugural address, declared that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. So he's trying to kind of bring the country together here a little bit. The election of 1800 has sometimes been called the Revolution of 1800 because of the peaceful transfer of power and because the election finally demonstrated that ordinary people had a right to play an active role in politics. Now, interestingly enough, the issue of slavery also plays a role here. Jefferson received every one of the South's 41 electoral college votes. But if 3/5 of enslaved people had not been counted in apportionment, John Adams would have been reelected. So in his inaugural address, Jefferson talks about, he calls it the United States a rising nation, spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations that see power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. He called America the world's best hope, a chosen country. So he's including some really grand rhetoric here about the new country. He and his fellow Republicans set out to carry out what they believe was the original aim of the American Revolution, to reduce the dangerous power of the federal government. To do this, they meant to turn back a decade of Federalist policy. Among his first acts as president was to pardon anybody who had been imprisoned under the Sedition Act, many of whom, of course, were members of his own party. The inherited Federalist governmental establishment was really small by modern standards, but Jefferson hoped to make it even smaller. He reduced the number of government employees and slashed the Army and Navy considerably. He abolished all of the taxes except for the tariff, including the unpopular tax on whiskey. He aimed to minimize federal power and eliminate government oversight of the economy, basically to get rid of the Hamilton economic system. But this proved to be very difficult to achieve in full. Jefferson once lamented, we can pay off his debt. He's talking about Hamilton here. We can pay off his debt in 15 years, but we can never get rid of his financial system. So the financial systems that Hamilton had put into place ended up being pretty enduring. Jefferson distrusted the judiciary. He didn't like that they were appointed, not elected by the people. But during his presidency, the Supreme Court was led by a man named John Marshall. John Marshall was a Federalist. He was a strong believer in federal supremacy, and he was the one to establish the Supreme Court's power to review the laws passed by Congress and also laws passed by the states. The first landmark decision of the Marshall Court came in 1803 in the case of Marbury versus Madison. So what was this case about? So a man named William Marbury, he was a judge. He had been appointed at the last minute by President Adams to be a justice of the peace for the District of Columbia. Adams, however, had left office before Marbury's commission could be delivered. This letter that says, yes, I'm appointing you as the Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia, is sitting on the desk in the Oval Office. President Jefferson refuses to deliver it. Marbury sues, seeking a writ of mandamus, basically a judicial command requiring Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, to deliver his commission. It's, sort of a little wonky, but back in the day, one of the things that the Secretary of State did was basically the Secretary of State was kind of the government's HR person. So it was Madison who was supposed to send this commission. And when he didn't, then Marbury sues and says, no, we want the judge to say, we want the judge to command you to deliver my commission to me. The Supreme Court, this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's in a bit of a pickle here. If they refuse to order Jefferson to deliver the commission, the Republicans, remember, Marshall's a Federalist, the Republicans would win by default. But if the court does order the president to deliver the commission and he refuses to do so, the court will be humiliated and will have virtually no power. Cleverly, Marshall finds a way to navigate this tricky situation and at the same time assert the power of the Supreme Court. He says, yes, Marbury, you are entitled to this commission. You have gotten this job and you have the right to sue to have this commission delivered to you. But, he argues, the Supreme Court cannot issue this writ of mandamus because the section of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that allowed the courts to order executive officials to deliver judges' commissions, this was itself unconstitutional because it exceeded the power of Congress as outlined in the Constitution. So Marbury's entitled to his commission, but the court doesn't have any power under the Constitution to order Madison to deliver it. But what the court does have the power to do, Marshall established, was to determine whether an act of Congress violates the Constitution. This is a power known as judicial review. Not many people recognized it at the time, but this case was really significant because for the first time, the Supreme Court is saying we have the right to interpret the Constitution and decide whether laws passed by Congress are adhering to it or not. So that's a little bit about this really important case. It kind of establishes the power of the Supreme Court. And as we're going to see, of course, the power of the Supreme Court using this power of judicial review is going to become more and more influential as time goes on. So what should we take away from all this? I think we should take away that this is a period in which a lot of things are in flux. There are a lot of questions over how strong the federal government is going to be. What powers does the federal government have? What powers do branches of the federal government have? Like, what can the Supreme Court do? What does Congress do? What does the president do? How are we electing people? There's a lot that's still sort of being worked out in the first few years of the early republic. And I think it's a really interesting period in American history because of that. And hopefully you've enjoyed my talk today. All right, so that's it for today, and take care, everybody.